Hey friends, and welcome to the very first episode of What Do You Do? Now this series is going to contain all of the full interviews that I've had in terms of trying to cover all the job roles that are out there. If you haven't seen it already, make sure you go back and check out the summary videos. If not, and if you're here to see the full interview, then make sure you keep watching. Hope you guys enjoy.
Hey everyone, so welcome back to the channel where we're going to try to discover all the different types of roles that are in finance, tech, and the education industry. So what we're trying to do is really trying to give you an insight into what someone in that role actually does and how, if you were interested in that role, how you would get into that role. And probably one of the most important questions is, will this role be relevant within the next 5 or to 10 years? For today, we're going to be talking about the role of a UX and UI designer. And we have a very special guest here with me today, which is also a friend, and I've been traveling with him for work, and I'll probably screw up the introduction. So for Vish, for everyone watching, would you be able to give an introduction to yourself, and how would you explain what UX or UI design is?
Awesome, can do. Thank you, Ben. Hey everyone, I'm Vish. I am a UX UI designer. So I've been working with Ben for a long time, almost 2 years now. We both work at IBM as of right now. And more specifically, I work as part of IBM's customer transformation and experience team, which we go to market as IBM iX. So I've been working in this role for 4.5 years, of which probably I spent close to 3 and a bit more, specifically focused on user experience design and that role and that capability. But yeah, a little bit about me though, outside of UX design, I'm an avid designer in everyday things. I do a lot of 3D printing, which is a hobby that I've just picked up on. I've got a little cute dog. Unfortunately, he's really scared right now because there's lightning going on, so he's running around outside scratching on the door. But yeah, I'm an overall fun guy, and I love design. So let's talk a little bit about design today. Cool.
That's awesome. And look, I think UX, UI design has been blowing up recently. People seem to be talking about it. People seem to want it in terms of companies. And I think if people were interested in this job, right? So how would you go about in terms of describing what you actually do as a UX, UI design? Because again, people probably have a lot of misconceptions as to what you actually do. And especially if I was someone out there who want to actually get into this role, I'd probably want to know what you actually do.
Sure. So the way I split it, right? So it's always like UX/UI. So I'll explain the two roles, and it's one of the misconceptions around UX UI being one role, but it can be one role. So UX design, right? Think of it as a bunch of techniques or methodologies and processes that help solve problems while staying focused on the people that face those problems. So that's UX design. It involves a lot of researching, framing a problem, and then working with people, or we call them the end users, to define, prototype, and validate potential solutions to those problems. So an example might be designing the user experience for a mobile banking app. So the UX designer would need to talk to the customers of the bank, figure out what their problems are, if an app might help them solve those problems. And if the app is the right solution, then they would prototype it with those same users in terms of the type of information that they need to see, the look, the feel, how it's going to work, and eventually land on something that the user loves, understands, and wants to use. And that's kind of where you enter the UI design world. So UI design is it's much more specific, stands for user interface design. And that is the literal, the look and feel of a visual or digital design, or a digital system. So, this is a lot more involved with the development teams. You're looking at specific components, color theories, fonts, like how does it actually look, and how does the user interpret information from the user experience? So the two work hand in hand together, but they're slightly different, and you will find a lot of UX designers are also UI designers. Hopefully that explains a little bit about the two.
And like you were saying, you work a lot with the dev team. Does that mean you need development knowledge, coding skills, etc.? Is that something that you think that you'd need?
Yeah, so good. It's good to have. I say it's not necessary. It's good to have. So personally, right, I've got a background in IT, so I didn't actually study design. So coming out of that, I learned a little bit of code, and the only part of that that really stuck with me was front end, like HTML, CSS type, which is a lot of the work that a designer would be more involved with, which is the actual look and feel side of things. But I don't actually think it's a necessary skill. It does really help though. If you do have a bit of development knowledge, it really helps you when you're sitting with your developers. You can talk kind of the same language, you can understand some problems, and you can even help them at times. So not a requirement, but it is a good to have, and it will help you.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think because when people think about it, it's like you're in tech and you're developing something, and people are using some like the interface, right? Like of a website or a screen or an app. Everyone thinks, oh, you need to be able to know how to dev, right? Like you need to know how to code, but like really isn't, right? It's about the whole experience, like the user experience part of it, and exactly where you're meant to press, what you're meant to press, and how does it work, and is it smooth flowing?
Exactly.
Yeah, and then look, if say I am very new, I'm very fresh, and I actually want to get into UX/UI design, so either or, any sort of tips that you're going to give someone? So 3 tips or something that you'll be able to give. Is education relevant? What sort of tips would you give someone if they were starting from scratch, if they want to get into UI or UX design?
Yeah, so good question. 3 tips I would say, and maybe like a bit of background to that as well. So for someone completely fresh coming out of this, so I like, for example, I didn't follow a design pathway into this world, into this role. So I studied IT at UTS, or University of Tech Sydney, and that gave me a really broad overview of the technology industry, the frameworks and process that we use. But I had a personal passion for design ever since I was young. So that kind of helped me. And I was like, what's the intersect between tech and design? And it was UX. There's like the perfect intersect in a UX designer. So that's the path I pursued. But around like 3 tips specifically, I think number 1, the sooner that you start, the better, because you want to start building that portfolio and that skill set. And technology is literally changing like almost every day. So you want to just get started as quickly as you can, because you will be working with technology. So there's a lot of free online resources to get you started. And as long as you have a passion for solving problems, then I don't think there's anything holding you back, right? So if you're already in the IT or software industry, then you might be able to look for opportunities at your existing organization. If you're in a different, like let's say you're a graphic designer and you want to move into UX design, you can start bridging the gap between the design capabilities that you need so that you can apply for new roles with confidence. And if you're completely fresh, then follow these education and online resource pathways, set up a solid foundation for yourself. There's a bunch of degrees that you can now do in interaction design, in creative methodologies, things that didn't exist when I was at uni. So there's a lot of entry-level ways to get into the industry, and after that, number 2, I think, would be to find the right company and work style. So UX has a lot of pathways and varying role types. For example, like you could pursue in-house or design consulting like I have. And that means you work for an organization that either owns a product or a service or is developing products and services for other organizations. You could do a more agency-oriented design. So these are companies that might be a bit more advertising or marketing or creatively focused. So you would be doing a lot more hands-on, detailed design work for one of these agencies. Or you could pursue freelancing and be your own boss, get hired by various organizations or companies on small contracts. You might be working on your own, or you might be working with a temporary team. So it's really important to figure out which pathway suits you best. And for me, it was design consulting, because for me, I prefer the scale and the problem solving element over the hands-on design type work. And then I think number 3, I would say, is to start building your confidence and curiosity. So always ask why, to understand the deeper meaning behind something. And I think this is really a UX designer's core skill, which is to be able to identify the root of a problem. So you don't fix a service like a surface level symptom. So your companies sink millions of dollars into solving what they think is the problem, only to like release the solution and it just flops. So you got to make sure you can confidently say that, yes, I understand the problem. So curiosity and observation are probably a designer's best friend. Those are probably my 3 tips.
That's huge.
This role.
That's huge. And like not only that, like not trying to sell IBM or anything, but I think that's already been a really good place to be. Especially, yeah. And it's like you mentioned, right? Like you should just start now, right? Like rather than just waiting on it and trying to delay things, because again, it's like that quote, right? Like the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, right? Like, but the second best time is to do it now, right? Like, so
right
like
now.
just do it. And then like you'd eventually get into it, understand the sort of the differences between them, the gaps in it, and then you'll be able to figure out your own sort of gaps. Then, like you mentioned, right, take on the educational course. There's heaps out there. Like everything can be found online these days. It's so insane. Yeah. So get that course that you need to get into, just be able to build that portfolio. Because like as you do the courses, you're naturally just building an asset anyways. They tell you to do something. So you can just showcase that portfolio anyways, which is going to lead into the next questions later on. But from there, right? Like, so if people are like, okay, cool, like I've got my 3 things I need to do. It seems like I know what, if I were to get into this role, it seems like I know what the sort of tasks are and the things I'm going to do. But again, probably something that everyone's always conscious of when they go into some job, right? It sounds amazing. It sounds too good to be true. But then is there anything that's within this role that seems a bit, that's not realistic, or that, maybe misunderstood by the society, which you could probably clarify for everyone here?
Yeah, so there's so much. I think a lot of it comes down to like the field. I wouldn't say it's new, but I would say that it's evolving, and it's evolving really rapidly. And ever since, companies like Facebook and all of those online digital platforms have come through, that's really driving this role. So the role is constantly evolving. So kind of if I was to say there's like 3 different things, right, that are misunderstood or need to be better interpreted. Number 1, I would say that there's a lot of talk about UX, UI, product, service, design, all the different streams of design. And this is going to vary a lot by the size and scale of the organization that you work for. But I would say that as a UX designer, you will most likely dabble in other areas of design as well. And most of the time, as I was mentioned before, that area is going to be user interface design or service design, which kind of they sit on. Service design might be a little bit more upfront, whereas UI design is a little bit more tail end. But yeah, like for example, working at IBM as a design consultant, while my role might be identified as a UX designer, in reality, I'm also a design researcher. I'm a UI designer. I'm a visual designer, a service designer. So I think a better identifier for my role is a digital product designer, because that's actually what I'm doing. I'm designing the user experience for digital products. You might also be part of a company that's so big that each role is individually set up. So you really only work on UX. Someone else is going to be doing UI. So it really depends on where you end up. Number 2, I would think that people say that you need to be an extrovert to be a UX designer, just because of the nature of the role and all the talking and communication that you have to do. I don't agree with that. So I think that anyone can do the job. It's just how much you're willing to step out of your comfort zone. So myself, for example, right, I was quite shy growing up. Tend to lean more towards being an introvert, but I can turn that notch up when I need to. So it's just about how much confidence you have and how prepared you are to do the role. I really think anyone can take it on. And the last one, I think, is that UX design doesn't, and this is going back to the nature of, where do you work and where are you applying this skill set. But UX design doesn't always mean that you're building apps. So while a lot of the use cases will revolve around you designing a digital solution, it is a myth. UX design is actually, it's just a bunch of tools, techniques, frameworks that can be used to solve any problem, digital or not. Again, it depends on where you're working, the scope of your problem. Now, for example, at IBM, I've previously worked with some of Australia's largest banks, but not all of that work was actually around building digital solutions. There was a lot of market research and identifying trends, disruption risks, looking at how banks could position themselves in the future and really transform with modern technologies. And none of that involved building an app. So always remember that UX is a toolkit for problem solving, not an app building exercise. You know, you can do a lot of things in this world.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, all of those, because even like working with you, right? And then there'll be another video on service design, which we interviewed Joe about. But yeah, like you mentioned, right? And especially in consulting, if you're a designer, right? Like you're a designer, like you do all these other things. It's really hard to
The
label.
whole thing.
Yeah, the entire end to end, right? It's very hard to say you're only doing this specific part of the project unless you have a massive team, right? That you have very specific roles that you're going to be doing and touching base on. Then that's probably when you're going to be focused on that. But even still, you're going to be communicating with others, you're going to be helping others out, and you're going to have to, put at least one foot in when you're doing it. And I think that's a really clear thing. Like I think before going into this, I always thought UX or UI design was just building an app, like or a website, right? Like that's a massive misconception. I think when it comes like after learning about it and talking to you guys, you're like, no, we don't do that. We're doing all these other things. We're doing workshopping. We're doing our research. And I was like, and then I went to you guys. Well, when do you guys build the app? And he goes, sometimes we don't. We don't even need to. Right? So yeah, that's massive in terms of being able to clear that for everyone. Just so people coming into this don't go, all right, I want to be a UX UI designer, but actually what you really want to be is like a front end developer or something like that, where you're actually doing more coding and actually developing the app. Now, this is probably a more interesting topic because when someone is looking for this role, they'll look at a job description, right? So I looked up multiple job descriptions of what a UX UI designer is, and I picked out 3 of the most interesting ones, and I want you to go, whether that's realistic, legit or not, or is this company just asking for too much, right? Again, obviously, the job description is dependent on the company, but these are the sort of general trends that I've just been seeing. Again, doing my due diligence as a designer as well, right? So most of the companies actually were saying that, in order to be a UX UI designer, you have to be a qualified professional with over 3 years of experience, right? Like relevant experience, that means. So in design or your desire to grow. Like, do you honestly believe that that is true? Or do you think maybe like 1 or 2 years or at least having some sort of interest in it would be good enough?
Again, exactly what you mentioned in the role. It's like relevant experience, right? So I think around a year or 2 working in the role, you really figure out what it's about. You understand the process, you understand how to repeat it. So I think if you're actively working in that role, then 1 or 2 years is a good starting point.
Yeah.
If you're not in the role, then it's a little bit harder. So, when they mention 3 years, I think 3 years is just a little bit of an arbitrary term. I don't think you really need 3 years of experience, but you might be a developer who's been working for 5 years, and it's like a parallel stream. So you probably worked with designers. That experience also counts, and that it becomes a strength. So if you work in like a parallel to a design role, then that becomes your strength when you want to become a designer.
Makes sense.
I think it's the question around like, are you fresh to the industry? Because if you're fresh to the industry, then
coming out of uni,
coming out of uni, you need to show something. Do you have a portfolio? Can you show a passion project that you did on your own? Like you might have solved a fake problem, but at least you went through the process and you can show someone, I'm good for this entry level job because I understand the process. So entry level, I don't think you need experience because your company should be able to guide you. Probably bigger companies will be able to do that more so than a smaller company that is expecting someone with the skill set. But yeah, it's a mixed bag, I think, for that one.
It kind of answers my second one.
Coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And it answers the second sort of point where they're asking for a portfolio, right? Like if I like, because in the job description goes about you, these are the things you should have, and I think you've answered it throughout this whole thing, right? Like having that portfolio is actually pretty important in order to showcase your actual design skills and your work, right? And I think even then, like that honestly is like the future of getting a job these days. It's no longer, well, I don't believe it's any longer a CV or resume, right? Like that's just words to people. It's now you need to show the sort of work that you've been doing. How do you tell that story in terms of what you've been through, what you've learned throughout the way? And I guess, like you said, if you have a portfolio, you're able to physically show someone what you've been doing, and they go, okay, good enough. If this guy's got the experience, we can probably teach him and teach him what we need to learn and all that stuff from the company at least. Which then, so I touched on that topic in terms of do you need development skills, but they do talk about specific products, right? So when it comes to UX design, they ask for specific products, and they were saying, okay, for you to be successful in getting this job, you need to be proficient in either Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch. Now, I know, as you mentioned, technology is rapidly changing, so maybe these might not be relevant within the next 3 years, but I think maybe having some sort of experience is probably important. What are your thoughts on this?
So when you think about UX, you think about UI. As a UX designer, when you enter the world of like hands-on, when you're starting to use a product, a design product, your expectation kind of stops at wireframing. So that's being able to, like, you can do wireframing on a piece of paper. You don't actually need to know how to use Figma or Sketch. It is a really good skill to have. It lets you do a lot more powerful prototypes. I think I would actually say, yes, it is something you need to know, and it's not hard to learn. So that's the really good thing about it. I'm pretty sure Figma and XD are actually free products, and they're super easy to use, right? So definitely a skill set you need. But if you're doing UI, 100%, there's no like, you have to know. You have to know how to use those tools. Yeah. Right, because that's your whole job.
So I'd say it's pretty accurate in terms of the job descriptions. But so you mentioned Wireframe. For those that don't know what Wireframe is, what is that in terms of the design world?
Sure, like a wireframe, it's kind of like think of like drawing out an outline of a website. So you don't really fill it out with any kind of content. You might have like one title. You have boxes to show that this is an image, this is a list. It's just literally, it's a wireframe of a digital platform. And what it does is it helps communicate the idea and get feedback around layout and how information is perceived. It's not to be confused with like an actual high fidelity prototype, which is going to tell you what color is it going to be, what's the content, what's the data, what's the info, all of that. So wireframe is that first step to kind of proving out a concept.
Yeah, right. So it's just being able to structure it, and then this is what it kind of could look like, and then we'll chuck in content later on to actually see and work out the finer details of things, right? Like exactly what you mentioned.
You iterate on it.
Yeah, color, title, the size of the title, if it's in bold and all those other details later on. Like we can all figure that out.
That's when you start getting into that UI design, like the heavy UI, the actual visual elements, all that stuff. You start with a wireframe, and then you build it, and you end up with, your final, like what you're going to actually develop.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think like doing that makes more sense. Or maybe because I come from IBM, we've learned like iteration is probably a key thing. So rather than going into super detail without getting any feedback, it's more important to just get a rough sketch, get feedback, and you keep working on it throughout until you get to your final product.
Yeah, it's all about being agile.
Yeah. And I've got one final question, probably the most important one, right? So again, we've talked about your awesome role, what it does, what it entails, how you can get into it as well, some misconceptions behind it. But again, as someone who's, I guess, risk adverse, who wants to future-proof themselves, going, I want to make sure I assign myself up for a role that will be relevant within the next 5 to 10 years, right? So it's a bit more of a controversial question, especially you being in that role right now. But I mean, everything's transferable at the end of the day, right? So your skills can be transferable. So I think that's probably the most important part. But realistically, and like I want to get your thoughts on this, is whether you think your actual role as a UX or maybe the UI part of the design will still be relevant within 5 to 10 years.
So I think I love this question, right? It makes you
controversial.
Forces you to think about like what's going to happen. And I think a lot of people think about, like, when you think 5 to 10 years, you're like, how far is AI going to go? Like, can AI get to the point where it can, it can interview someone, figure out what their problems are, and synthesize those problems, and then figure out what the best way to solve it is. So I do think AI is not there just yet. There's a lot of personal things that need to be done in the UX UI role. So I think the crux of the role will still exist, but I actually think there might be a bit more to do in the next 5 to 10 years, and actually more opportunity. So, the role's already changing. There's a lot more emphasis around understanding technology, ethics, how solutions solve business problems, as well as the underlying user problem. So I naturally see this role evolving or spitting into a more detailed or like business design oriented role. So you're not just the UX designer, you're the business designer. How is what you're making going to, contribute to the company's vision, to their bottom line? So there's a lot more, I think there's a more responsibility that's going to be coming into this role. But there's also a lot of opportunity with upcoming technology. So, when we say 5 to 10 years, let's just look at all the big things that we talked about in 2021. Crypto economies, metaverse, all of these crazy new technologies that are not currently very user-friendly, right? So, like, for example, I dabble in a bit of crypto, but I have no idea, like, the extent. There are people out there that are like, oh yeah, DeFi, this, like, they fully understand it, but trying to actually understand it for yourself without having a little bit of tech backing, it's very hard. So already, right, there is so much opportunity with modern technologies to put some UX in there and make it accessible to the rest of the world. So I think, there's a whole new world of problems out there that need to be solved. And these solutions and technologies need to be used seamlessly, just like you can use a mobile phone today. So I don't think UX is going away. Come back and ask me in 10 years and let's see what I'm doing then.
We'll have another one of these in 10 years time, and then we'll see if your opinion changes. But I completely agree with you. Like, as you mentioned, right, how far AI can go. I think being a consultant, right, like, you need that personal touch, right, that personal interaction with certain people. They don't know what their own pain points are, their own problems are that they need to solve. So if an AI is somehow able to understand all of that from just one guy giving a speech, that's amazing, right? Like, I don't know how advanced we are with that, but like, even like you mentioned, right, so as we change and as new technology comes in, it's quite hard to understand to the general public, right, to 80% of the population, right, if you don't have that technology background or being able to understand it and research it yourself, it may be very difficult. So there will always be that some sort of user experience problem, right? And as as we were saying, like, the generation gaps, right? And you're probably saying, parents struggle to use certain phone apps, certain websites, and then obviously we will struggle with the metaverse or anything else in the future if we don't stay with the trend, right? And we don't follow one. So there's always going to be some specific aspect of that user experience flow that we're going to have. Look, I want to be able to give you this chance to say if there's anything else about UX design or UI design that you want to bring in, or any sort of tips in terms of what you do and all that stuff. Yeah.
I guess my leaving remark would be, if you're thinking about doing UX, then 100% jump in and do it. It is such a satisfying job. I think it's because it's quite
not biased,
right? Yeah, not biased, but it is very full on job. You're doing a lot of research at times, and you're really deep inside a problem space. And there's this concept called the design squiggle. So anyone watching should look it up. It's literally it shows you how a designer goes through their journey, and it goes out, starts normal, then it goes into a crazy loop. You don't think you know what you're doing, and then it settles up a bit, and then it goes crazy again, and then it flatlines because you found your solution. So it is very, very, if you're passionate about solving problems, you will love this job. And I couldn't recommend it anymore. I'm passionate about it, and I see myself doing it for the next, until AI takes over my role. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vish, for your time. Look, and for everyone else out there, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment down below if you have any questions for Vish as well, or anything about UX, UI design, feedback, any opinions on it. It would be great to be able to hear from you guys. But yeah, thanks so much, Vish. And I had a really great time talking to you about UX, UI design, and I hope we'll be able to speak more in the future. I'll speak to you in 5 to 10 years to see if this role is still relevant.
100%. Thanks so much, Ben. Love chatting with you. Anytime you need some design insights, just hit me up.
No problems. Definitely will do. All right. See ya.